Warren, Fed Chairman Bernanke today forecast slower economic growth, and he talked specifically about sluggish job growth, saying that's going to restrain the pace of this recovery. You, on the other hand, have been adamant about saying you just do not see the U.S. falling into a second recession. What are you seeing, feeling that many of us aren't?
Yeah, well, we have 70-plus businesses that I get figures on in real time, basically, and virtually all of the businesses that are not associated with residential construction are doing fine. And I've been particularly attentive to them in August and September because I was curious as to whether the economic turmoil would be affecting them. It has not so far. Anything connected with residential construction, and we have about 5 businesses that are, it's just flat on its back. It's in depression conditions, and it's been that way for 3 or 4 years now. Because we had this huge binge in housing and we're sleeping it off. But we can't accelerate that very fast. That's cured by creating fewer houses and households, and that takes time.
What could change your outlook that the U.S. doesn't risk another recession right now?
Well, I'd have to see something coming along that's stopping demand in the areas other than residential construction. I mean, more people apparently are eating dilly bars this year than a year ago. But it's true in jewelry, it's true in furniture, it's true in electronic components, all kinds of businesses we're in. If something panics the world, like we were panicked in 2008, I mean, in 2008 things stopped, and you should have seen the figures I was seeing then in the first few weeks of October. The world stopped. People were afraid. And if people get paralyzed by fear ever, you can stop any economy.
Is the recipe for that in preparation now, though, with Europe and with the dysfunction in Washington?
Well, I think
are we getting there?
I think that there are 2 different factors. People don't know how Europe will affect the United States, so it's an unknown. It obviously has an impact. It's nothing like what happened in 2008 from our standpoint. But would I rather have Europe proceed smoothly than not by some margin? But it is not like what we faced in 2008 post Lehman. In terms of dysfunction in Washington, that has some effect on people. I mean, people want to believe in their leadership, and when you see these polls where they essentially don't believe in leadership in Washington, it probably has some effect on the behavior. It doesn't have any effect, incidentally, on our behavior. We will spend $7 billion this year on property, plant, and equipment at Berkshire. That's an all-time record. 90% plus of it's in the United States. We love spending money here, and we're finding plenty of ways to do it. And so I don't sit around in the morning and read the headlines and change my mind about whether we should, add more cars at our railroad or do something like that at all.
In May, when we sat down, you told me that at that point you didn't see any big risks to the U.S. economy. A lot has changed since then. In recent weeks, specifically the situation in Europe, since then over the past few months, the situation in Washington. Do you see now one great outstanding risk to the U.S. economy than you did this spring?
I really don't. I see a more dispirited citizenry, but I don't think that's a huge risk. I mean, people aren't afraid; they're discouraged. I think is a better term, and they do not like what they've seen in Washington clearly. But that's not like the fall of 2008 when they were wondering whether their money market accounts were any good or whether they would have a job next week or next month. It's a different condition.
When you look at Europe right now, many feel as though it's a perilous situation. You've said that Europe has not brought the U.S. economy down yet. It hasn't. How bad does it have to get where it truly impacts us?
Well, if their situation gets somewhat chaotic over there, if there's contagion.
It's not now?
Well, it's pretty close. When you have the bonds of major countries payable in the same currency yielding 300 plus basis points more than Germany, that's something that was not contemplated, believe me, when the euro was established, and it's not something sustainable at all. So they have to come up with a different answer, and they have to come up with it soon, and it has to be pretty darn decisive. And the problem, of course, is you have 17 countries, and it's hard to have Europe speaking with one voice or acting with one strong action.
We're feeling it here in the United States. Today, banks are selling off steeply. You've got steep declines from Bank of America to Morgan Stanley. Is this because investors can't short the European banks? Is this something else? Is this sell-off in financials, is it justified? Does it make sense to you?
Well, I think it doesn't particularly make sense. I mean, I'm not. If I were to have a choice of buying or selling certain banks in the United States today, I'd be buying. I think people are very worried about the banking situation in Europe, and Europe is it's a huge part of the world, and there is a lot of interconnectedness between banks, although probably less than a year ago. So it's natural when you have fears about the financial world to particularly concentrate it on banks and investment banks in terms of instant market action. But that's not the way I approach it. I try to think of where things are going to be in 5 years or something, and if things get cheap enough, I like to buy.
To the average investor right now that's looking at this sell-off and not understanding how it's happening, why it's happening, thinking it feels a little bit like 2008, but the fundamentals aren't the same whatsoever, what do you say to them?
Well, I say to them, let's say Europe. You're reading all these headlines about Europe, or let's say you're discouraged about Washington or whatever it may be. If you owned a good farm, would you sell it today because of that happening? I mean, you've had it for 10 or 20 years. It produces corn and soybeans, and you got a good tenant farmer running it for you. You wouldn't even think about it. If you owned a good apartment house and you had tenants in it and you were collecting rent, if you own a good company, it's the same thing. It's just because you can see the quote every 5 seconds. If you had farms quoted every few seconds, people would be saying, I wonder whether it's going to rain tomorrow, and you have a rain channel, and they would tell you, maybe you better sell today and buy tomorrow farm. People don't look at those kind of investments that way. But owning a good business is just like owning a good farm or owning a good apartment house. Those are investments where you lay out money today with the expectation that they will do well over time in the future, and forget about the headlines and forget about what the market's doing.
So if I'm reading this correctly, you're saying that the fundamentals are much stronger now across American businesses, questions about Europe, but than they were in 2008, and the headlines are overblowing the situation, and there's some panic that might be unnecessary.
Well, in terms of the United States economy, we're going to be doing considerably better 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And if you own a farm, keep it. If you own an apartment house, keep it. If you own stock in a good company, keep it. If you own a good private business, keep it. You don't have to do something just because other people are doing a lot of things every day.
I want to talk about President Obama. You still publicly support the president?
100%.
You just held a fundraiser with him in New York?
Not with him, no, for him.
For him,
yeah,
in
he was
New York.
Not there, no. He never planned to be there.
Given the policy decisions that President Obama has made, are you still as supportive of him as you were in 2008?
Yes, I'm as supportive. That doesn't mean I would agree with every decision, but I'm as supportive. I've never voted for any president who did exactly what I wanted him to. And if you want somebody who's going to do exactly what you're going to do, you have to run for president yourself, which does not interest me in the least. So, even in your own household, you're not going to agree with every decision that's made. In terms of the vision he has for America, how he feels about very important issues, I agree with him.
Are you more outspoken now than you've ever been on public policy and politics? It seems like it.
Well, it's interesting on this tax thing that's gotten a lot of attention lately. I wrote about that 3 or 4 years ago. I gave the same figures even and everything. It just so happens that the times are such that it caught up. But sure, I'm more out in the open than I was 30 years ago, and I've gotten better known over time. And there's a chicken and egg aspect to that, I suppose. But so if I say something now, it's more likely to be on CNN than it would have been 20 years ago.
But is it because, you are very outspoken on public policy now, on politics. You're publicly supportive of President Obama. Is it in part because Washington, the one thing most people can agree on is that there's a lot of dysfunction in Washington, that it's broken, and so private business leaders need to step in and impact policy?
Well, I don't think when you become a business leader that you put your views on the world in a blind trust or anything of the sort. And I was president of the Young Republicans Club at the University of Pennsylvania when I was 17 or 18. So I was on a national radio program called Youth Wants to Know on CBS when I was 15. So I've always spoken out on things I believed. I've changed some of the things I believed over time, but I grew up in a family where my family believed in that. And if you have public policy belongs to the public, and if you're a citizen and you think you have something to say, there's nothing wrong with saying it.
You feel a sense of responsibility now, a little bit?
It isn't responsibility exactly. It's just a view I have that if I am in a position to see certain things in business, I see more things than the average person is going to get a chance to see it, or in economics, and I think particularly on issues where people so often talk their own book, essentially, which is on taxes. I mean, if you look at all the industries, all the labor unions, all the teachers unions, all the individuals belonging to any kind of an organization, they're all out there pushing for their own policies in Washington, and in many cases, I don't have I'm not tied to some particular constituency, and it gives me an independence that I like.
You still publicly support President Obama, but some Wall Street heavyweights and just business leaders that very publicly supported him in 2008 are either not supporting him now or they're mum on the issue at this point. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think they obviously they're probably bothered some by some of the rhetoric that was issued, particularly earlier in this administration. They may not feel loved, and when you're campaigning, your job is to make everybody feel loved. It's kind of it's the irony of politics. Mario Cuomo said it best, that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. And the job in winning elections is to raise everybody's expectations. Whoever gets people's expectations the highest about what's going to happen in the next 4 years under their leadership is probably going to win. And then after you get in, you have the problem of lowering those expectations, and that's not easy. But every president faces that. So
you've said before that I've never once in my life called President Obama, but
that's true.
We have the Buffett Rule now that's been proposed by President Obama. I think there's this public perception that you and the president have a very close relationship. Can you clarify your relationship with the Obama administration?
Sure. Anytime I get a call from the administration, I obviously take it, and very, very occasionally, it would be President Obama himself. That might be twice and maybe 3 times since he's been in office. And sometimes it's somebody else in the administration. And I'm always glad to talk to him. I can't recall a case. I called one administration official once, I think. But I've never called President Obama. I never will. I mean, I think that'd be very presumptuous. But incidentally, I would do that with any administration. I mean, if I can be of help to the government anyway, I mean, I'm glad to at least take the calls and talk with people.
But you wouldn't say you're closely tied to the administration?
No.
The Buffett plan, there's been a lot of twisting of words over this proposal.
I've noticed.
Just a little bit, and what it means. Clarify for us exactly how you believe this plan would work.
Yeah. I believe, and I've had input from a lot of people, and including a number of what I would call the ultra-rich. And I think the best way is to make sure that the ultra-rich, the people making at least $1 million and then a second layer perhaps at $10 million, pay taxes, federal income taxes and payroll taxes, money sent to the federal government, that gets them into the 30s in terms of the percentage that they pay. That's what the people in my office pay. I mean, every one of them pays something in the 30s. And, I'm sitting there at 17 and a fraction percent because I get most of my income, a very high percentage, from dividends and capital gains. And right now you have the 400 highest taxpayers in the country. You can look them up on the internet. And for the most recent figures, they averaged incomes of over $220 million a year. That's up 5 for 1 since 1992. How many of the people that are listening to this program are up 5 for 1 since 1992? And at the same time, their tax rate as a percentage of taxable income has gone down from 29% to 21%, and they pay virtually no payroll taxes. So they are sitting there on average a dozen or so points below what the people in my office are paying. And now, not all of them are. Some of them are high-paid athletes or high-paid CEOs and all that, and they're paying normal tax rates. So if they're paying normal ones and the average is 21, there's a lot of people down at 15 or below, like some of my friends. And those people are making, like I say, an average of $220 million a year. and paying rates far below what you pay and your listeners pay, viewers pay. And I just think in a time when we're asking 300 million people, and going to be asking them for some time, to tighten their belts and maybe give up some promises that they've heard from their government, maybe pay a little more themselves in some way, to not have the ultra-rich pay rates that are similar to what they're paying, I think is just plain wrong, and we can solve it by a minimum tax for people in these very high income levels. It won't hit most of the people in the high income levels. It might only hit 50 or 60,000 people.
Michelle Bachmann and the Heritage Foundation both say, Warren, if you think you're not paying enough in taxes, you can go ahead and write a check to the U.S. Treasury.
I think that it's kind of cheerful to see. Makes you cheerful to see that childlike faith in the American public. We have a deficit, of 1.2 trillion or something like that, and they say the way to solve it is by voluntary contributions. I mean, if they really think that that's sound tax policy, God bless them. I mean, they have a different view of human nature than I do. If we really do have a problem, let's put it into law. I mean, my 15% rate is in there because of law. And if people think that's the right rate for the ultra-rich to pay, let's just have a little referendum on it. But the solution is not to have everybody decide what they're going to voluntarily pay every year. Michelle might like that, but I'm not sure what percentage she would pay if it was entirely voluntary. But I'm not sure I want to find out.
So when it comes to the middle class in America, many of them pay a much higher tax rate than you, most. What do you see happening to the middle class in this country right now?
Well, they've gotten squeezed like crazy over the last, particularly the last decade. But if you look at the Forbes 400 this year, just came out about a week ago, the top 400 people in the United States, according to Forbes, have over $1.5 trillion of wealth. That is up 7 for 1 in the last 25 years. Again, I would ask the viewers whether they're up 7 for 1. So the middle class deserves a better break than they're getting. This country is going to prosper in the future. I just want to make sure everybody shares in it. And the rich, we have not been hurt by all of this. There's been plenty of agony in this country. And there's going to be more agony, and there's going to be more agony when we start modifying promises we've made to them. The ultra-rich should do their share.
So then, we're seeing this small but burgeoning movement on Wall Street and in some other states, Occupy Wall Street. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I was in Wall Street last week, so I saw a little.
You saw it. Do you understand then some of the frustration? Some down there know what they're protesting about. Some, frankly, don't.
Sure.
What's your take on it?
Well, I think that I think a lot of it's very uninformed, but the feeling is real. And there is enough basis in that feeling that we ought to get rid of that basis. I mean, you want enormous diversity in results in this world. You want people to get very, very rich to develop something that their fellow man needs. I mean, Steve Jobs, whatever money he makes, he's changed the lives of all kinds of people, and you can name one after another. There should be all kinds of opportunity. But there also should be a taxation system that is fair. And I think when people are giving vent to these emotions, they're unemployed, their families are struggling, they may have lost houses, they're going to look out for some visible sign that they can strike at, and Wall Street's a natural thing. Wall Street is not an evil place, but they're not going to send voluntary checks to the government either. And it isn't just Wall Street. I mean, it's all over the country.
You can't dispute that the disparity between wealthy and poor continues to grow, and that the middle class is shrinking no matter how you look at it, just from a jobs perspective. What do you think, Warren, it means to be rich in America? What makes someone rich?
Well, that depends on where you live. I think I'm rich if I'm 81 years old and I've got a lot of friends and I still got an interesting job. I mean, it can't, and decent health. Like, it can't get better than that. Doesn't matter how much money I have, but it's nice to have money too. And we should have, over time in this country, and we will have, unless we are very unwise, we will have more and more rich people. I mean, it is a country that's become much, much richer over time. And that's terrific, and I just want to make sure that it doesn't all go to the few at the top.
The way to ensure that it doesn't all go to the few at the top, some would say, is to finally create jobs in this country. The president has come out with his jobs plan. Bill Gross told CNN he doesn't think that the president's jobs plan is going to create jobs. What do you think?
Well, I think it's an additional stimulus plan. They don't like to call things stimulus plans these days, but we have a huge stimulus plan existing right now. Our deficit is 10% or so of GDP. Mm-hmm. Well, that's huge stimulus. We don't call it stimulus, but stimulus is when the government is spending a lot more than it's taking in. That's the definition of it. And you can call it a stimulus plan. It can be unintelligent or intelligent stimulus and all of that. But we have a huge stimulus plan going on right today. And if the Jobs Act is enacted, it will provide some more stimulus. That will have some effect. But I think we have used most of the tools of monetary and fiscal policy. And the biggest thing holding us back, and I'm not sure this is fully realized, but the biggest thing holding us back is the housing industry is in a depression. And it's a huge industry. It was $22 trillion of wealth for the American public at the peak. I mean, it was their biggest asset. So you have a big segment that has not come back at all, and it won't come back until we get rid of this overhang. And the overhang is not as big, in my view, as people think. I mean, we are creating more households than houses. We're chewing up the problem, but we can't chew it in a day or a week. And that will be when unemployment falls significantly.
On the president's jobs plan, you say, like it or not, call it this or not, it's a stimulus plan.
Stimulus, sure.
And you sound a little skeptical, frankly, Warren, that this is the right plan. Yet the president addressed the nation and said multiple times, pass this bill and pass it now. Treasury Secretary Geithner said, if Congress is incapable of acting, then policy will be damaging to growth.
Well, I do think we've used up almost all of the power of both monetary and fiscal policy. That doesn't mean that I think that every additional unit that we put into it is not going to produce something. But it is not like we come from a policy of no fiscal stimulus and tight monetary policy and then have some big major change in those policies, which would have a huge effect. We pulled out the stops a few years ago. We went to huge fiscal stimulus and we went to unbelievably loose, easy monetary policy. And we should have. That was the right thing to do. We probably should have done it even bigger on the fiscal stimulus side. But the amount of gas left in the tank in both of those areas is relatively small. That doesn't mean the American economy is going to flourish in the future, but we do have to work through the housing overhang. And like I say, that is a big segment of the economy, much bigger than people think because of the fallouts. I mean, in our carpet plants and our insulation plants and all of that sort of thing. So we will come out of it. There's no question about that. I can't tell you the date.
But so is the American Jobs Act the right way to spend trillions of dollars of this country's money that we don't have? Or does it need to be more of a focus on housing? I mean, really, is this the right plan?
Well, if there were a way to focus on housing, believe me, I would actually call the president if I thought I had a great answer. The answer to housing is not to build more houses. Mm-hmm. I mean, basically, you have to change the ratio of houses to households, and that changes, but it changes slowly through natural thing. And you can't really change that. We could change our immigration policy. And if we had 1 million very wealthy immigrants come into the country, we would take care of the housing problem. We'd have a whole bunch more households and no more houses. But there's no practical way, in my view, and if I came up with one, I'd sure suggest it, to really change that equation fast. But it is changing. It is changing, and that's important for people to understand. More fiscal stimulus would have some effect. You know, how much, I don't know, but the biggest thing is housing.
Has President Obama called you to consult you about the American Jobs Act to ask if it is the proper way to spend this country's money right now?
The last time I talked to him was when he was on Martha's Vineyard. You know, I don't have a lot of calls with him, and he's a very, very smart man. He gets things like that. You don't have to take half an hour to explain something to him.
Is there a better idea out there that you're hearing right now from any candidates, from any business leaders, than what the president has proposed on jobs?
No. It is additional stimulus to a country that is already experiencing very, very substantial stimulus. It's certainly better than going in the opposite direction of contraction on that. And we have done the right things, Poppy, by and large, since Lehman Brothers. I mean, everything can't be perfect, but we've really done the right things. And we did them under the last days of the Bush administration with Republicans, Secretary of the Treasury. So we we just had an incredible bubble, and it affected the asset of 69% of the American public, and their biggest asset in a great majority of cases that they owned on borrowed money in a great many cases. So it was a absolute body blow to the economy, and we're coming back.
The drumbeat for repatriation is increasing. We saw it a handful of years ago, I think 2004. It did not show us that it created a lot of jobs in this country. No. The head of the President's Jobs Council, GE CEO Jeff Immelt, said to me there's a higher likelihood that repatriation this time around would create good economic growth. I don't think that you agree with that.
No, I don't.
Do you?
I don't. I admire Jeff enormously, and we're good friends. And almost all the businessmen feel this way. And incidentally, we own stock in companies where the CEOs would love to see repatriation at a very low tax rate, and where they did it 6 or 7 years ago. But if you make a lot of, American business has a lot of money to do things. I mean, we got money to do things. Apple has got $70 billion.
Most valuable company in the world.
There's all kinds of money to do things. I mean, I don't know of any major business that is looking at a good project in the United States, forget about the whole building industry, where they say we don't have the money to do it. I mean, it just isn't the case. You can borrow money cheap. You got lots of cash on your balance sheet. Unused takedowns on lines of credit at American banks are about at an all-time low. I mean, American business has a lot of money. And if you earn a lot of money in Ireland, you pay a 12.5% corporate rate. Now, if you want to bring it back in the United States, they're going to charge you 22.5%, and to bring the rate up to the 35% overall, that's our rate. And companies say, well, we don't want to do that, so we're going to leave our money in Ireland. And they say, now, if you let us take it back and only charge us 5%, we'll bring it all back. And of course, what they did last time is they repurchased stock and do a lot of things like that. There's a certain irony involved here, because if you let them repatriate money at a very low rate, what's their incentive? Their incentive is to keep making money over there at very low rates, thinking they'll get it back here without paying much tax. As it is now, since they can't get the money back without paying the additional tax, they have more incentive actually to build in the United States, because they're going to face an eventual 35% tax on that money made in Ireland, unless the government lets them off the hook. So if the government says to them, we're going to let you repatriate it this time, maybe we'll let you repatriate it 5 years from now and make you pay a 5% tax, surprise, they're going to build more stuff in Ireland, because they figure they have a permanent lower tax rate by being over there. This way they only have a temporary lower tax rate, because when they take it back, they get socked for it. So it actually, in many cases, I would think it would tilt people toward investing in the United States by not letting them repatriate it cheaply. That is not what my friends want to hear. But
so why are your friends calling for it?
Well, because
they want
to bring the cash back at a low rate. And I would too. I mean it's human nature, and they're working for their shareholders, and their shareholders say, the lower the tax rate, the better.
Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, he told me that he called you about his, let's call it the Schultz pledge.
Yeah, he's a good guy.
Twofold. He's said to CEOs and the average American, until Washington can get its house in order and get a long-term deficit reduction plan in order, don't contribute to political campaigns. And he's called on business leaders across the board to hire. Starbucks is putting its money where its mouth is. What do you think of him stepping out like this? Do you agree with his plan?
Well, I really admire him stepping out. I admire any businessman who steps out, whether they agree with me or don't agree with me. I mean, I just think that a fellow like Howard is a very bright fellow. He sees a lot of the economy, and if he has ideas, he's not getting paid anything for stepping out, and I really admire him, and I did talk to him. I think across the board, I mean, I would sort of believe in trying to get the right legislators in there. That's the biggest job, and I think if American business opts out of contributing to people, somebody else is going to contribute, and it probably gives incumbents an even larger advantage, since the person that's not in office probably needs more money to campaign. So I don't know that I would attack it. There are certain legislators that I feel very good about, and I'm going to contribute to them.
What about Howard Schultz?
But I understand Howard's feelings entirely.
What about Howard Schultz's call on American business leaders to hire? I'm wondering if you think, Warren, I mean, in many cases, the demand's not there. You're seeing it come back in some of Berkshire's businesses, which span industries. But if the demand's not there, you're a public company, you're at the helm of that company, is it responsible to hire if demand's not there? Or do you believe maybe there's a moral obligation as the head of an American business to hire people, to just put Americans back to work?
No, I think you hire people that you need to hire. And at our railroad, we're probably up 4,000 people or something like that because we need it. We're now carrying, we had 200,000 carloads last week, and that's up from a bottom of 152,000. So we need more people on the railroad. Our carpet business sales have fallen off because of home construction, and we need fewer people. Now, I think American business job is to come up with new and better products and do it as productively as possible. I think the function of the government is to take care of the people that, through no fault of their own, fall through the slots at a time like this.
Finally, you've often said that with China and the U.S., it's not a zero-sum game. Right. But one thing you've said that you really admired, that you noticed in China last year, was that government and labor maintain a common direction with zeal.
Yeah, government, labor, and management, yeah.
They're on the same page.
Very often, yeah.
Do you think that the United States at this juncture could take a page from China on that front?
Well, I think we would be doing a lot better if government, labor, and that's an almost impossible prescription. But if government, labor, and management work together, it accomplishes a lot of things, and particularly if they work at odds, and we see that frequently in this country. The economy pays a penalty.